All right, so the last really important thing that we need to talk about is this the perspective with which we view the world. And that is specifically this difference between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism is defined as the tendency to view one's own culture as superior and to apply one's own cultural values in judging the behavior and beliefs of people raised in other cultures. So this is basically viewing other cultures with judgment, right? That you judge other cultural traditions based on the experiences that you have had within your culture, and things that are similar to things that you have experienced are often viewed as good or acceptable. Things that are vastly different are often viewed as not okay, not acceptable. And so each of these perspectives has value, has pros and cons. Okay, and so as we look at kind of the pros and cons of ethnocentrism, ethnocentrism contributes to social solidarity. Social solidarity is not in and of itself a bad thing. This can contribute to a sense of value and community among people who share a cultural tradition. So dividing the world into what we call us versus them is a very human trait. This is a human universal. Now, what's not okay about this ethnocentric kind of view is the fact that we use it as justification for discrimination and prejudice, right? So, recognizing what's similar to your culture and what's different isn't a problem, so to speak. But then using that as a reason to discriminate against people who practice other cultural traditions, that's where we get into trouble, right? So, what's an example of an ethnocentric viewpoint? Well, I mean, religion is pretty ethnocentric, right? So, when we talk about religious practices, I mean, most major world religions view themselves as the quote unquote true religion or the one religion, right? I grew up as Southern Baptist and we were supposed to proselytize. We were given an evangelical mandate that said we were supposed to get out there and spread the news. And that was like part of our um, church's definition of what they did, definition of like their acceptable church behavior. We had missionary work, etc. So that is an example of kind of viewing the world in an ethnocentric way. This idea or this tendency to only see things that are your cultural features as valid and worthwhile. So this is really what's behind the colonialist mindset, right? And this is really what basically um, what Europeans have gifted the rest of the world is this notion that somehow Europe's way of doing things, this idea of manifest destiny, that Europe's way of doing things was better and worthy of being spread around society. All right, so the flip side of this is cultural relativism. Relativism. This is there where behavior in one culture is should not be judged by the standards of another culture, and that each culture's expression and behavior is uniquely valuable and valid. And so these this idea of cultural relativism can be very valuable. I mean, this is basically where anthropology is coming from, right? That all culture is worthy of study, and that all cultural traditions are equally valid, equally worthwhile. And so, from kind of the pros of this, right, it gives us we see less judgment, right? We are better able to appreciate other cultural traditions when we view those cultural traditions as valid and worthwhile. And that can be a good thing in the long run. But this also has kind of a negative consequence. At its most extreme, this would argue that there is no superior international or universal morality, that the moral and ethical rules of all cultures deserve equal respect. And so we do have to ask ourselves, is this valid? is this true, right? Should we be accepting of any and all cultural traditions? And so, I pose that question to you. Should we? Do all cultural traditions deserve kind of equal status and equal support? And that's where we get into this interesting discussion surrounding human rights, universal human rights. So, the idea behind human rights is that there's a justice and morality that's above and beyond and superior to the laws and customs of particular countries, cultures, and religions, right? That somehow, just by virtue of being human, we have rights, we have universal human rights. And often these universal human rights include things like the right to speak freely, the right to hold religious beliefs without persecution, the right not to be murdered, not to be injured, not to be enslaved or imprisoned without charge. I love asking undergraduates, what are our universal human rights? And people are very quick to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, I mean, that's our Declaration of Independence for our country, but um, some of that might be co-opted into this concept of universal human rights, but some of that, just really is unique to our own country. So we've seen human rights violations being brought up um, in the news with respect to things like the war in Iraq, the Nazi treatment of the Jews during the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Serbia, and female circumcision, or what's in a very ethnocentric way of phrasing it, right? Female circumcision is the culturally relativistic way of expressing it, but calling it female genital mutilation is the ethnocentric way of describing that behavior. And so, in general, most people agree that there are universal human rights that we as humans have the expectation that we should be able to have and possess, and um, that some moral imperative for governments to step in and intercede on behalf of um, people who don't have access to these same human rights. All right, so there is also this concept of cultural rights. This is the right of a group to preserve its culture, language, and economic base. This is vested in the not in the individual, but rather in the group. And so, one expression of this is the idea of indigenous intellectual property rights. This is where societies are able to preserve their core beliefs, knowledge, and practices. So, according to Indigenous property rights, a particular group may decide how Indigenous knowledge and its products may be used and distributed and the level of compensation that's required. So, there is there's a group in the Amazon. Um, I'm spacing on their name. It's a very short name. It's Ara or Ama. Let me see. I'm gonna look it up on on my phone real quick. Amazon Group Ethnomedicine. And anyway, this particular group. Um, this particular group became really concerned with um, I can't find which group this is, but anyway, this particular group became really concerned with the fact that many of their youth were no longer staying and practicing natural lifestyles. That instead they were going on to the cities and working for pay and stuff. And so they decided it was very critical that they develop an encyclopedia of their ethnomedicine, an encyclopedia of all of their knowledge of Amazonian plants that can be used in this kind of healing context. And so they did that. They developed basically um, their complete encyclopedic knowledge, and they only have this in their own language. There's been a push from the government of Brazil to translate this into Portuguese or Spanish. There's been a push from um, pharmaceutical companies to get copies of this ethnomedicine encyclopedia, um, so that they translate it into English so that they can start to look for commercial exploitation of things. And the group has held firm. They refuse to translate their ethnomedicine into a language that makes it more accessible to basically colonizers or white people. And anthropologists have stood in staunch support of this particular group, saying that this is clearly something that falls under this umbrella of indigenous intellectual property rights. So, we are going to have your weekly assignment this week is going to be an international policy um, kind of treatment. So you are going to have to develop some sort of or identify some sort of international policy. So that means that it has to be some sort of topic or policy that affects at least two countries. So you cannot use, for example, um, like well, I'm trying to think of what would not be a good option. I was going to say the Keystone Pipeline, but you could use that because it's a Canadian business entity that's really trying to um, put that pipeline through. You could use something like a border wall, right? Because that's going to affect the United States as well as Mexico and other Central American countries that have a lot of immigration to the United States. So, but the important thing here is that it has to be a completely, it has to involve at least two countries as two of the parties. Okay. So if you choose some sort of domestic policy that does not, in fact, impact people from another country, then you're not going to get full credit on this assignment. I really want you looking at something that's international. Okay. And you're going to have to write a treatment, basically, an analysis of that particular policy issue. And you're going to have to do so in light of this framework of either ethnocentrism or cultural relativism. So you're going to identify the people at play in this policy. You're going to identify kind of what the crux of the issue is. You are going to define ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and then you are going to give your opinion as to whether you think this particular policy, as it's being applied, is ethnocentric or culturally relativistic. And then you're going to have your hand at writing a fair policy. Okay, so just going to keep that in mind as you listen to the lecture, right? That the purpose of being able to see like from both perspectives is that it gives you this unique way of viewing the world that allows you to see when institutionalized prejudice and discrimination is kind of rearing its ugly head. So, regardless of your own personal identity, whether you consider yourself a person of color or not, whether you consider yourself with aligned with indigenous politics and rights and identities versus that of colonizers, right? Simply having this tool where you can examine people's behavior in light of um, cultural relativism or ethnocentrism can be really, really useful. So here we have a picture of a macaw whale hunt in 1910. We had seen, for example, um, among many entities, including the Japanese, including populations throughout like uh, Scandinavia, Siberia, etc. We'd seen um, prohibition of whale hunts with recent resurgences where governments are trying to allow whale hunts again. All right, so cultures are not static. That is one thing to keep in mind. They don't stay the same. They are dynamic, they are ever growing, always changing. That's not to say that core beliefs can't be an integral part of a culture for a long period of time. But we've got to recognize that culture is constantly changing. And so, as such, we need to identify mechanisms of cultural change. Diffusion is defined as the borrowing of traits between cultures. This has happened throughout human history. Contact between neighboring groups almost always comes with the borrowing of certain cultural features. There can be direct diffusion, which is between two adjacent cultures. There can also be indirect diffusion, where you've got one or more intervening cultures or through some long distance medium, like the mass media, information technology, etc. And diffusion can be forced when one culture subjugates another. and imposes its customs on the dominated group. So this is what we see with colonialism and imperialism starting at the hands of the Europeans in the 1500s and beyond. Cultures can also change through acculturation. This is the exchange of cultural features that result when groups come into continuous firsthand contact. It may occur in either or both groups. Parts of the culture change, but each group remains distinct. And so, an example of this would be pidgin languages. So, the language of the Louisiana Bayou, right? This Creole language that has aspects of French, aspects of English, etc. These pidgin languages often emerge to facilitate trade or communication between groups. We can also have cultures change through independent invention. And this is what we talked about with respect to the advent of agriculture, right? This is the process by which humans innovate, creatively finding solutions to problems. You end up with comparable inventions in different societies that can result in cultural generalities. So the fact that in all agricultural societies, the diet is based off of some carbohydrate staple, right? Though the carbohydrate staple varies depending on where you are, that is a cultural generality based on the independent invention of agriculture. So we are seeing at an ever increasing pace the rise of globalization. This is a series of processes that work to promote change in a world where nations and people are increasingly interlinked and mutually dependent. So there are a number of forces of globalization, including international commerce and finance, travel and tourism, transnational migration, the mass media, and high-tech information flows. But we've got to recognize that while globalization is not inherently good or bad, so to speak, right? It is forcing people to have to cope with larger regional, national, and international forces. And so it is generally erasing cultural particularities. It's erasing some of the features that define these cultures and that have been part or kind of at the root or part of their heritage for millennia. And so indigenous peoples and traditional societies have had to devise strategies to protect their autonomy, their identity, and their livelihood. In some cases, this has been retreat, right? When we think about what's going on in the Amazon, as groups that have been labeled uncontacted, but actually are completely uncontacted, we've got a mythology surrounding uncontacted tribes. But in groups that are kind of defined as uncontacted, one strategy that they've used is simply to retreat back into the forests and minimize contact between themselves and the outside world. Um, in other cases, right, we're talking about what the indigenization of certain cultural practices. We're talking about opening oneself up to ecotourism. We're talking about a variety of ways of really striving to maintain their cultural livelihood. And so there are three key basic features in this new global economy. It is an economy that we would describe as post industrial. And we'll revisit this a little bit next week as we talk about adaptive strategies, but it's based on knowledge and information. These networks have grown to become transnational, and these core activities then proceed as a unit in real time. I mean, especially with our time throughout the pandemic, right? Much of what used to be done in person is now done virtually. And you can have business meetings from opposite ends of the earth where everybody's talking about things in real time via some platform um, like Zoom or Google Meets or Microsoft Teams, right? And we're seeing people that increasingly live their lives across borders. Really, what's driving a lot of this are multinational corporations. So it's not necessarily national governments. It's commerce. It's organizations. It's businesses. And we talk about in the United States how we basically have ascribed personhood to corporations through some relatively recent policy and legal challenges. So nations have less control over their own economies than corporations do. And this has come with protests. There are anti-globalization activists that have protested at the expense to farmers, workers, and others at the bottom. Globalization, particularly this economic globalization, at the rise of multinational corporations, This is generally only good for a few people, right? This is something that is very much benefiting people in positions of power, and very much um, hurting people who don't have power, people who are at the bottom in terms of this socioeconomic stratification. So just something to keep in mind, kind of as you look at the processes throughout the world and identify what's really how globalism is increasingly uniting the world. All right, so this gets at what your weekly assignment's going to be for this week. In 1 or 2 pages, you're going to outline the current event or international policy issue. I want it to be something within the last 5 years. Okay, so I don't want you to pick something like from, I don't know, the early 2000s or the 1990s or something like that. You're not looking at an historical policy issue, you are looking at something that is current. All right. You need to clearly define the parties that are involved, particularly designating the nation making the policy and the nation or groups that the policy affects. You need to define both ethnocentrism and cultural relativism and explain how the policy that you were discussing is tied to one of those viewpoints. Then you need to ask, in light of universal human rights, is this policy valid or morally acceptable? Why or why not? And lastly, address what a fair policy would look like, particularly if you feel like the policy as it's being implemented is not fair, right? What would you change about it? How would you make that policy more fair? All right, so in summary, know these defining dimensions of culture, what it means that culture is learned, shared, symbolic, all encompassing, and integrated. Know the biological basis for culture, how we share features with other primates, and how human culture is different than these similar features in primates. Distinguish between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and how both relate to this idea of universal human rights. Understand and be able to provide examples of cultural universalities, generalities, and particularities. Identify and understand the mechanisms of cultural change, and then know how globalization may be defined, and how people may affect and be affected by these interrelated forces of globalization.